Mark and Sarah were driving through the desolate stretches of Wyoming, returning from a long-awaited vacation. The road they had taken to shorten their trip wound through a forested area with no signs, no traffic, just endless trees. The golden glow of evening was starting to fade, giving way to the gloomy twilight that rolled in like heavy clouds. The car radio had long since lost its signal, leaving only the crackle of static, and their phones stubbornly displayed no service. "Do you think we're still on the right track?" Sarah asked, holding a GPS whose screen remained frustratingly blank. "Yeah, we should hit the highway soon," Mark replied, though there was now a hint of doubt in his voice. Suddenly, the car gave a violent shudder. The engine sputtered loudly and stalled. Mark cursed under his breath and hit the steering wheel, but every attempt to restart the engine only produced a faint clicking noise, as if the vehicle had given up on their journey altogether. "Damn it, looks like we're stuck." They climbed out of the car, and a suffocating silence settled over them. It was then they realized just how far they were from civilization. Nothing but dense forest walls surrounded them, with no trace of life. The cold began creeping through their jackets, and with each passing minute, their unease grew. "We don't have much choice but to wait," Sarah muttered, trying to keep her nerves under control. After about half an hour, headlights flickered in the distance. The sharp rumble of an old pickup truck shattered the stillness of the woods as it pulled up beside them. From the cab emerged a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. His clothes were simple, an old shirt, worn jeans, and a jacket that carried the faint scent of oil and tobacco. "Evening," he greeted, tipping his hat slightly. "Car trouble, huh? Bad place to break down. No signal out here." "Yeah," Mark replied hesitantly. "The engine just died on us. Any idea where we could find a mechanic around here?" The man shook his head. "Not tonight. Mechanic's already gone home. But I've got a place just a bit down the road, cozy enough. You can stay the night, and we'll get the car fixed in the morning." "It's not safe to stay out here in the dark." Mark and Sarah exchanged glances, both feeling a creeping unease. But with nightfall fast approaching, the idea of staying alone in the forest seemed worse. "Are you sure it's no trouble?" Sarah asked. "Trouble?" The man chuckled warmly. "Not at all. It's nice to have company every once in a while." There was a strange undertone to his friendliness, something hovering between hospitality and persistence. "I'm Charles," he added, extending a hand. Mark nodded and shook it, though Charles's hand felt cold and rough, like the hand of someone accustomed to hard labor. They climbed into the pickup, leaving their car on the roadside. As they drove, Sarah nervously wrung her hands, sneaking glances at Charles. He talked a lot about a small town called Falls Town that, according to him, had been dying for years, about his few neighbors, and how much he loved the comfort of his home. His voice had a strange monotony to it, making Sarah feel uneasy. After a few minutes, they arrived at an old house on the edge of town. It looked neglected, but there was something oddly charming about it. The wooden steps were sturdy, and a lantern on the porch cast a narrow beam of light over the entrance. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. "Come on in, get comfortable. A real home's always open for weary travelers," Charles said with a wide grin as he opened the door. The inside was cozy, but there was an unsettling atmosphere about it. The wooden furniture, candles on the shelves, and a peculiar scent, a blend of herbs with a faint hint of decay, gave the sense that time had stopped inside these walls. "My wife loved decorating this place," Charles said with a touch of nostalgia, as if that explained the old-fashioned interior. "Your wife? Is she home?" Sarah asked. Charles paused for a moment, then smiled in a way that was impossible to read. "No, she left a long time ago." "Oh, I'm sorry," Sarah murmured, feeling she had stumbled onto something sensitive. "No need to apologize," he said quickly, gesturing for them to follow him into the living room. "I'll go whip up some dinner. You must be hungry." Sarah and Mark sat down in the living room. Sarah ran her hand along the armrest of an old chair, and her fingers came away dusty, as if the room hadn't been cleaned in a long time. "What do you think?" she whispered, leaning toward Mark. "I think we don't have much choice," he replied quietly, though his eyes mirrored her unease. Charles returned from the kitchen with a broad smile. "Dinner will be ready in just a bit. You two relax, you'll need your strength. We'll get everything sorted in the morning, I promise." The couple exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this house felt off, but there was nowhere else to go. Charles laid out dinner. A hearty stew, roasted meat, fresh bread, and a bottle of wine. Hungry from the long day, Sarah and Mark dug in, trying to hide their exhaustion. Their host watched them with a satisfied smile. "Always good to see guests enjoying a real home-cooked meal," he said, raising his glass. As they ate, Sarah paused, sensing something strange about the meat. Tasted oddly familiar, but she couldn't place it. A knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. Mark, oblivious to her hesitation, grinned. "Must be some kind of local delicacy. Venison, maybe?" Charles gave a faint smile. "That's right," he replied, but something about his tone unsettled Sarah further. She quietly set her fork down, pretending she was full. After dinner, their host wished them good night and retreated to his room, leaving the couple alone. In bed, neither of them could sleep. Every sound felt magnified. The floorboards creaked as if someone was walking nearby, and soft rustling in the hallway kept them on edge. Sarah lay wide-eyed, her anxiety growing by the minute. "I can't stay here," she whispered, gripping Mark's hand. "There's something off about this place." Mark pulled her close, but his nerves were just as frayed. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," he murmured. "I saw a small hotel on the other side of town. We'll stay there." Sarah nodded in the dark, feeling a small measure of comfort from the plan. At dawn, they went down to the kitchen, where Charles was already sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He looked up, greeting them with a warm smile, but this time, the smile didn't seem quite as genuine as it had the night before. "How'd you sleep? Hope the night was peaceful," he asked, his gaze lingering on their faces as if searching for an answer. "Yes, thank you," Mark replied curtly, getting straight to the point. "Any word on the car? Did the mechanic say anything yet?" Charles took a slow sip of his coffee. "Not yet, but he figures it'll be good as new by tomorrow." Sarah and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. They knew they couldn't stay here another night. "Actually," Mark began carefully, "we were thinking of checking into the little hotel we saw across town. We wouldn't want to trouble you further." Charles tilted his head, his smile now thin and deliberate. "No trouble at all," he said softly. "Why waste money on a room? You're already under my roof, safe and sound. Besides, your car will be ready tomorrow, and you'll be on your way." He poured them each a cup of coffee, motioning for them to sit at the table. They hesitated but sat down, knowing it would only make things worse if they refused. Mark took a sip, feeling the warmth of the drink ease some of the tension in his body. The coffee tasted good, almost too good. He relaxed a little, though an uneasy thought gnawed at the back of his mind. Charles watched them closely as they drank, his piercing gaze impossible to read. It was hard to tell if his friendliness was genuine or if something far more dangerous lurked behind that smile. In the middle of the night, Mark and Sarah still couldn't sleep. The silence in the house felt unnatural, too dense, as if the air around them had frozen, waiting for something dreadful. Sarah lay with her eyes open, every muscle in her body tense. Suddenly, through the thick stillness, she heard a strange sound. A soft, dull thud, followed by another, as if an axe was biting into something soft. She held her breath and gently touched Mark's shoulder, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Mark rubbed his eyes groggily and strained to listen. The thuds came again, irregular but deliberate, each one cutting through the silence like a warning. "From the kitchen or downstairs?" he whispered. His hand shook as he took Sarah's, motioning for her to follow him. They crept to the door and paused at the threshold. The hallway was bathed in flickering light, leaking through a crack in the door below. Their hearts pounded so loudly it felt as if the whole house could hear. Mark gave her a nod, and they carefully descended the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The light was coming from the kitchen, but something about it was off. A lantern on the table cast odd shadows on the walls, as if hiding more than it revealed. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, they saw Charles. He was leaning over the table, wearing an old apron stained with dark spots that looked unsettling under the dim glow. In his hand, he held an axe. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was chopping a large piece of meat, wet and heavy with moisture. On the floor sat a large bucket, collecting thick, dark red liquid that dripped and splattered at the bottom with muted splashes. Sarah clutched Mark's arm, her fingers icy. A primal fear surged through her chest, paralyzing her, making it impossible to look away from the eerie scene unfolding in front of them. Time seemed to stretch infinitely until Charles suddenly stopped. He slowly raised his head and turned, locking eyes with them. His face carried a strange calm, and in the low light, his eyes gleamed with an unsettling glint. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin devoid of any warmth. There was nothing friendly in it, only a sinister foreboding. His voice, when he spoke, was even and composed, yet carried an unmistakable threat. "Late night, isn't it? Go on back to your room. Nothing to see here, just prepping some meat." Mark and Sarah froze, trying to mask the panic rising inside them with each passing second. They nodded silently, too afraid to speak. Slowly, they backed away, retreating from the kitchen, careful not to make a single unnecessary sound. As they climbed the stairs, they could feel Charles's gaze drilling into their backs. He remained in the kitchen, standing perfectly still, and they could almost sense his presence following them, even when they were out of sight. In their room, they shut the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath. Their hearts raced wildly, as if ready to burst from their chests. Mark and Sarah exchanged looks, but neither said a word. The fear was too overwhelming, and the oppressive silence in the house was suffocating. They knew something was terribly wrong in this place, but there was no choice. They would have to wait until morning. The next morning, when they came downstairs, Charles was already dressed in an old jacket and ready to head out. He looked just as friendly as the day before, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I'm just running to the store real quick. Need to pick up a few things," he said, casting a brief glance at Mark and Sarah. "Once I'm back, we'll head to the mechanic." He smiled and gave Mark a friendly pat on the shoulder. The touch was too soft, but something about it felt unsettling. Without waiting for a response, Charles calmly walked out the door. Left alone, Mark and Sarah exchanged a silent glance. This was their chance. "We need to find out what's going on here," Mark whispered, avoiding looking toward the door Charles had just exited. They knew they had to act fast. The house suddenly felt much colder, and every sound seemed suspicious. Near the kitchen, they noticed several old brown stains on the floor. Sarah crouched to inspect them more closely. It was blood. She shuddered, and together, they followed the trail, which led them to a heavy door in the corner of the hallway. The basement. The door creaked open, and the sound echoed down below. A dense smell of dampness, old things, and something bitter and rotten hit them instantly. Sarah covered her nose with her hand, trying not to gag, while Mark, gathering his courage, led her down. The stairs were steep, cold, and slick. The dim light filtering through a small, grimy window near the ceiling cast eerie shadows on the walls. When they reached the bottom, they found a table covered with neatly folded clothes. Women's dresses, men's shirts, and children's t-shirts arranged by size. Next to them were small, worn-out sneakers that were still in good enough condition to be used. The clothes were far too new to have just been forgotten there. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking from fear. Mark moved closer and picked up one of the shirts. It still smelled faintly of laundry detergent. Nearby, their eyes fell on a stack of passports and wallets, carefully arranged. They flipped through them in horror. The photos showed smiling women, men, and children of various ages and nationalities. All seemed to be random travelers who had once found themselves in this house. "It's a trap," Mark whispered, realizing they were standing in the middle of someone's long and gruesome game. Then their attention shifted to a freezer in the far corner of the basement. It was packed tightly, and a black garbage bag bulged from it. Mark, fighting his revulsion, pulled the bag out and cautiously opened it. Sarah froze behind him. Inside was a severed hand. The skin had a bluish tint, and the fingers still bore traces of a manicure. Sarah let out a muffled cry, but Mark clamped his hand over her mouth. "Shoo, shoo," he whispered, though he was barely holding himself together. As Mark struggled to stay calm, Sarah noticed something else on the shelves. Amid the clutter were jewelry pieces, gold chains, wedding rings, and bracelets. Some looked old, but others were brand new. Her eyes widened as she spotted something familiar, a bracelet identical to hers. But it was hers. It was the one she had lost just last night. "Mark," she rasped, pointing at the bracelet. What had initially been a strange suspicion now solidified into a horrifying certainty. This place was a trap for travelers. Their seemingly friendly hosts were far from what they appeared to be. And the dinner they had eaten last night. Sarah clamped her hand over her mouth, struggling to suppress the wave of nausea rising in her throat. Mark's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. What they had eaten might have been from people who had stayed here before them. They stood in paralyzed silence, surrounded by clothes, jewelry, and the passports of those who never made it out of this house. What now? Run for it? Stay and pretend they hadn't discovered anything? "We need to get out now," Mark whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Just then, they heard the front door creak open. Charles was back. Mark and Sarah, filled with horror, burst out of the basement, their hearts pounding wildly in their chests. They rushed to the living room windows, desperately hoping to break the frames or at least find a weak spot. But as soon as they grabbed the wooden frames, the cold truth hit harder than any blow. The windows were tightly boarded from the inside with thick planks, nailed down so securely that there was no way to tear them off. "Damn, everything's locked tight," Mark hissed, gritting his teeth. His shoulder throbbed with pain, blood oozing down his arm and soaking his shirt, but he was focused solely on escaping. "Mark, we're trapped." Sarah's voice trembled, tears glistening in her eyes. Suddenly, they heard a faint creaking. Both turned their heads to the door, their hearts nearly stopping. Charles stood in the living room doorway. A wicked smile spread across his face, and in his hands, he held a long kitchen knife with a gleaming blade, still stained with fresh blood. "Well, shall we start the show?" he said softly, as if they were about to play a friendly game. "I told you, there's always a choice. You can go easy, or you can go however you want, but you'll have to try hard." You're a psycho," Mark shot back, shielding Sarah, who was backing away closer to the wall. "We're getting out of here." "Oh, I've heard that many times, my friend," Charles replied with feigned sorrow, shaking his head slightly. "Everyone said the same. Some even made it to the door. But you know what's the funniest thing? No one was waiting for their return." Sarah was breathing heavily, trying not to lose her composure. She knew that any careless move could cost them their lives. "Please," she whispered, "just let us go. We won't tell anyone. We'll forget everything we saw." "Forget?" Charles grinned even wider, his eyes shining like a child who just thought up a cruel joke. "Oh, no, that's not how it works. You're already part of this house. And you know what's interesting? Others were in your place, and now they're part of me. And now it's your turn." Unable to hold back, Mark lunged forward, hoping to knock Charles off his feet. But he seemed to anticipate the move, easily dodging and, with one smooth motion, slicing the blade across Mark's shoulder. The knife sank into soft flesh, and the man staggered, screaming in pain. Blood sprayed onto the floor, leaving dark stains on the old parquet. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, but Charles was already closing in on her. She darted to the mantelpiece, desperately searching for anything to defend herself, and grabbed a heavy metal firewood holder. Her hands trembled with fear and panic, but she lifted it before her. "Oh, what a brave girl," Charles laughed. "Come on, hit me. I'll even give you a chance." He slowly stepped forward, giving her the opportunity to strike, but just before the metal touched his skin, he abruptly dodged, yanking the holder from her hands. With a swift blow, he knocked Sarah off her feet, and she fell to the floor, hitting her head on the edge of the table with a cry. "Sarah!" Mark, clutching his wounded shoulder, rushed to her, but Charles was already there. "Don't rush, buddy," he said quietly, as if it were an ordinary morning. "We have a whole day ahead of us." He stabbed Mark again with the knife, this time in the stomach. Mark collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as blood flowed from the wound in a warm stream. Half conscious, Sarah tried to crawl away, but Charles grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back to the table. "No one will notice your absence," he whispered in her ear. "No one will even ask where you disappeared to." He bound her hands and feet just as tightly as he had Mark's, and sat them next to each other at the kitchen table, which had now become their execution spot. He wiped his hands with a towel as if he had just finished a regular day in the kitchen. "I'll prepare something special for your last supper. It's a tradition in this house, so each of you can taste yourselves before becoming part of the next dish." Mark tried to say something, but blood was spilling from his mouth. He gasped for breath. Sarah only cried silently, understanding that their fate was already sealed. The house was cozy again. Sunlight gently fell on the kitchen table, where Charles was preparing another special dinner. This time, his guests were a woman in her 30s and a little girl playing with a stuffed bear, sitting at the table. "I always said that nothing compares to home-cooked meals," Charles smiled, pulling a roasted piece of meat from the oven. It was steaming and smelled so good that the girl could hardly contain her desire to taste it. The woman rewarded him with a warm smile. "You're so kind to invite us for lunch. This is a real treat for us." Charles placed a plate with hot meat in front of her and slowly turned his head to the girl. "Oh, you're going to love it. It's a special recipe," he said with a barely perceptible satisfaction in his voice. The woman took a knife and fork and cut a piece, bringing it to her mouth. She had no idea it was a piece of a person who had sat at this table just the day before. Charles watched with a smile as she tasted the delicacy, feeling a new rush of pleasure. The girl also reached for her plate, unaware that someone had once cried and begged for mercy over this very dinner. Hit the like button, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And remember, not every door should be open to visitors.